This is ContraZoom,
where we go back and forth about film.
I'm Dakota Arsenault.
And I'm Rachel Ho.
We are back with our third consecutive year of coverage of the Hot Docs Canadian International Documentary Festival. This is the 29th edition of the festival that celebrates the best in documentary filmmaking from around the world. This year it ran from April 28th to May 8th, and 225 movies from 63 countries were screened in person in Toronto and online. Today we're going to discuss 5 of the films that were shown during the fest. Before we do, how was your Hot Docs this year, Rachel?
Tiring. It came at a bit of a bad time for me this year. I was really overwhelmed with work, and so I didn't get to devote as much time to Hot Docs as I wanted to. But I saw some cool films that we were going to talk about. I also thought I always find it funny because when you just said the whole name of Hot Docs has a very long festival name.
Yeah.
The Hot Docs Canadian International Documentary Festival. It's very long, and I understand why we just call it Hot Docs.
It's also a little redundant. Hot Docs Documentary Festival?
It's Hot Docs Documentary Canadian International.
Yeah.
It's full of contradictions,
yeah.
the festival name. But overall, it was good, though. They did a hybrid this year. I did all online. I did get asked to go to one in-person screening, which was Kids in the Hall. They did a fancy premiere over on the Hot Docs Cinema, the actual cinema, the theater, on Bloor. And unfortunately, I couldn't go. But they had a number of screenings in person, all around Toronto, and they were using the Varsity Theatre, their theatre, of course, the TIFF Lightbox Theatre. And so it seems like a lot of people went, though, which is great. And then they did fully hybrid, online as well. So I think they did a nice job this year of still considering the fact that not everybody was going to be comfortable going into the movie theaters.
That's good. Yeah, it also kind of came at a weird time for me. I was just finishing work on the TV show I was working on. I didn't think I'd be able to get to anything, and I was able to watch some screeners. Obviously, here in Vancouver, I wasn't able to go to any in person. Not by
that's
choice.
That's your choice.
Yeah,
that was that's on you.
You know what? I should have flown in for it. You're right.
Yeah, I always find it fascinating people who fly in for film festivals. Not to say Hot Docs isn't worth it, because I think if you're a really big documentary head, I understand. Especially in Canada, Hot Docs is such a big deal. So I get people, but I find that impressive because I don't know if I'm just there to watch movies. How many festivals around the world would I fly just to simply be a participant in it? Not somebody who's writing about the movies or anything like that, but just you're just going to watch movies. I always find that really fascinating, the people who decide to do that, because they must really, really love whatever that film festival is about, if it's just general film or whatever, or documentaries. So I think it's interesting. So you should have. What's up with your dedication?
Obviously, something like Cannes I would go to, but that seems such a different planet. But things like Sundance or Telluride, that would be a pretty fun festival to go to in person. Sundance
I'd love to go to.
Yeah.
I'm not that interested in going to Cannes. Cannes actually coming up. Was it next week? I think. I know a bunch of people are flying over now, but I'm not that interested because it feels very stuffy to me.
Yeah.
It feels very you need to be very, you have to pack nice clothes. Whereas something like Sundance and TIFF, you just show up, you just, wear whatever you want basically. So, but I think Sundance would be really cool. I wanted to go this year, but then obviously for obvious reasons it didn't work out. So maybe next year, who knows?
I know a lot of people fly in for TIFF, and I think it's because it is such an easy festival to sort of navigate as a film watcher. You can go and go to the rush lines and wait in line, stuff like that. And you can still see a lot of the stuff you want to see. You can check out the red carpet, and it's very much easy to sort of make a personal connection to the festival.
I guess that's why TIFF has the reputation it does in comparison to Cannes or Venice even.
Yeah.
Because those ones those feel a bit more, like I said, just a bit fancier and a bit more industry-like, I think. Whereas TIFF is one that it does really feel like it's for people who like to watch movies, and you can just, and the Midnight Madness program, the fact that they have something like that, and it's such a unique crowd that goes to Midnight Madness. So I think TIFF does a good job.
I think they also
talking about TIFF,
purposely cultivate that image because it makes people want to come back to it, and it also makes filmmakers and celebrities sort of feel like they're connecting with their audience, because for the most part, it's the first time anyone is seeing this movie outside of people that worked on it, sort of thing. And so it's just an easy way for them to sort of connect real time with people.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true.
Yeah.
I mean,
but
it's if people, they know what they're doing. They know what they're up to. They don't need our opinion. They don't need our advice on what
exactly.
to do.
But we're here to talk about hot docs today. And there were 5 movies that we both watched. I watched one that you didn't see, and I think you saw a few more that I didn't see. So if we have time, we might touch on that a little bit. But for now, we're going to focus on 5 that we both saw. The first one is a movie called Blue Island, which won the Best International Documentary Feature Award. And the jury noted that for its evocative use of reenactments interwoven with traditional documentary forms to create a rich, socially grounded cinematic tapestry, the jury is honored to present the Best International Feature Film Award to Blue Island, directed by Chan Zi-woon. And the description of the movie is an egalic corollary to the fiery documentaries that captured Hong Kong's recent protest movement and its crackdown. The hybrid Blue Island takes stock of the region in an era where most pro-democracy protesters have either fled into exile or been forced into custody.
香港對我嚟講
This is a really beautiful and interesting documentary, and I'm glad we're talking about it, because for me, it's just fascinating seeing the comparisons of the Mao's Cultural Revolution that happened in the late 60s through to the 80s, and how that older generation of people who fought against the oppressive nature of that dictatorship, and then eventually now we're going back to these new anti-dictatorship protests where Hong Kong is trying to be swallowed up by mainland China, and you've got a lot of these like student protests and things like that, and how eerily similar they are. It's one of those things where like the more things change, the more they don't change, sort of thing. And so it's got this really beautiful sort of like older generation, younger generation look at, hey, back in my day, this is what it was like. Oh yeah, we're going through the same thing. The only difference is now, there's security cameras everywhere, everyone's recording everything on their phone, and police have more high-tech weapons and things like that. But, on the surface, it's exactly the same. And so for that, I found it just so interesting that you were able to take 2 eras and compare them so similarly of the people that were going through the same thing. Because yeah, it's so much of, are you a good person if you flee your country and turn your back on your family and friends? Are you a bad person if you stay and fight and get arrested and thrown in jail for 20 years? What happens if you get killed? What happens? All this sort of stuff. What happens if you eventually become what you fought against for years, which people in the US are very familiar with, this sort of like hippie anti-war revolution eventually became all the people that are now in control of society right now. They all turned their back on that. So it's just such a fascinating look at Hong Kong as a whole. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one, Rachel.
Yeah, so I mean, this one was the probably the one documentary when I was going through the list that really stuck out to me. My parents are from Hong Kong. They're born there, raised there. They moved to Canada back in, I think it was 70s, 80s. I should know that. But yeah, they moved around then, and then like they had my brother and I. And so it was obviously, it's like a very personal story. And it's tough sometimes because Hong Kong, like the topic of Hong Kong has become a very, very divisive issue, even amongst like Chinese people. And I'm not just saying like amongst like mainlander versus Hong Kong people or something like that. Like even within Hong Kong people groups, there's a big divide about who is quote unquote right and who is wrong. I loved like what you said about the movie, how they go back and they look at 3 very, very important events that kind of shaped Hong Kong to be what it is today, which is, like you said, the Cultural Revolution in mainland China, and the number of people, like it was like in the thousands of people who fled, and basically swam over. Like it's quite the story of like them wanting to have freedom. And Hong Kong at times, like it was looked at as being what they call like a joy island, like JOY island. And it's like a beacon of freedom. And it represents a lot of the things that we associate kind of with Western democracy, whether right or wrong. And then they talk about the riots that happened in the 60s, and that was actually pro-CCP riots that were against the British rule in Hong Kong. And then they looked at what was happening in Tiananmen Square in the 80s, in 1989, where obviously that was led by student protests. So there's a lot of interesting threads to draw to today. Like you have people, like generations who fought against British rule and fought for the CCP. And now they're kind of here going, well, what's going on? Like now we're fighting, you know, I'm not that patriotic anymore. Like I kind of see it through a different lens now. And then you have, like you said, the people who fled the Cultural Revolution to find freedom and a better way of life. And now all of a sudden they're finding that that very place is not, it has been like, as you very eloquently said, it's like being swallowed up by the same regime that had them in the first place. And then you have the generational divide of the young and the old. Like that's, I think, the biggest knock-on point is that the older generation is looking at the younger student generation in Hong Kong right now and looking at them and saying, how are you guys doing so much property damage? Like you guys are causing all these problems with the police. Like how you guys aren't acting like educated individuals. So there is that kind of fracturing within Hong Kong. But then, you know, if you look at the protests at Tiananmen Square, that was all led by students. And those are the same people who are the ones criticizing students today. So I think it highlights like a lot of things. It's a great film that just kind of encapsulates what Hong Kong has been through. And some of the themes that they talk about is the fact that like Hong Kong never really had its own identity. It's always been a thing of, it had traditional Chinese values. It's had expat influences. It's had British influences, obviously. And so it's never really been been able to dictate its own culture and what it wants to be. And now obviously we see that again, because now we see the CCP coming in and putting their culture over whatever we consider Hong Kong culture right now. And then, you know, the threads of looking at the differences between the old and the young. And to me, that's a very universal thing. Like you said, you drew comparison to the Americans. It's very easy when we're young to look at things through, you know, the rose tinted glasses, and we're young and we're youthful and you're more idealistic at that age when you're a student. And then as the world like hardens you as you get older, you kind of look back and you're like, what the hell? Like, you know, and I think people also are very biased in saying like, well, we fought for something that was worthwhile. You guys are just being ridiculous right now. So I don't know, it's like it encouraged a lot of discussion amongst my own family, of, you know, is it worth it? I think that's a big question too. Like, is it really worth fighting for? Because, you know, without getting overly political here, it's like, it's a losing battle. Like Hong Kong isn't going to win this fight. That's just not what's going to happen. So what's the point, kind of? But then you go, well, why would you just sit back and not do anything? So many of the great revolutions around the world, like had nobody stood up and done something, the world would look like a very, very different place if everyone just sat back and let dictators and authoritarian regimes take over. So it's an interesting movie. I loved it, obviously. Like, I mean, it's pretty much a movie that I told every single one of my friends who has Hong Kong roots. I was like, you guys need to go watch this. And I showed the trailer to a bunch of them and they were all like, a few of them, to be fair, a few of them were pregnant, so they're a bit hormonal, and they were like, I'm crying watching this trailer. I was like, it is sad. Like, it is very sad, especially for people who were born there and grew up there. Because the Hong Kong of today is incredibly different to what it was even back in like the 90s, you know? Like after 97, things changed quite a bit. So it's a tough watch. And I always try to think of it like, what if Canada kind of had gone through the same thing? Like, what if in 50 some odd years we look back and Canada is like just a completely different country, which it will be, but like in maybe more of a negative way, you know? And how would we react to that kind of thing? So yeah, I loved it though. And have my eye out for when it will have a wider release, because I think it's one of those movies that deserves to be seen by everybody, but particularly if your family's from Hong Kong, you're from Hong Kong, I think it's a really great, it's a really, really great film.
It's sort of interesting where I could definitely see this movie maybe being on the radar for the Oscars for next year, because, you know, it's a very well-made movie. It's got a unique angle to it. I think the commentary and the politics behind it are very timely. And so I would not be shocked if it ends up, being, maybe one of the 10 to 15 movies that are sort of in consideration and end up making like the long list for the Oscars because of just how well made this is. But
it's tricky, isn't it? Because what was it? Was it last year or 2 years ago? I think there was a documentary short called "Do Not Split," and that was just about the protests. And that China was not happy about that, and I think they didn't air the Oscars that year in China because of that was nominated.
Yeah, I love that documentary short. That was so good.
I won't lie, I couldn't finish it. Not because it was bad. I felt so sad about it. I just was I can't finish. I couldn't watch the whole thing. But that in itself is a good reaction. I would love it. I think like what you said, like we were talking more about, or I was talking more about the kind of the subject matter of it. But like if we look at it strictly from a filmmaking perspective, they do some really cool things with reenactments. Like reenactments and documentaries are always a little bit dodgy. Like sometimes they just don't turn out well, and they look like one of those A&E documentaries you'll see on a Saturday afternoon. And they just kind of look kind of tacky and stuff.
With like a bad wig on someone.
Yeah, it's hard. Like it's hard to bring history back to life without a massive budget that like HBO could give you or something like that.
Yeah.
But these guys, what they did was they would do the reenactments, and then I think like one of the key things was that they interviewed people who were actually involved in whatever event it was. So they found people who actually did flee from the Cultural Revolution, and they did swim over through the harbor into Hong Kong and asked them for their opinion. And then they had student protesters act out, like do the reenactments. And then they had like kind of a meta, is it meta? Kind of, where they were in the older generation who actually experienced it. They actually were in the reenactment, and they were asked like, is this what it was like? Like, is this how it was? And they kind of talk through it. And I found that really interesting because it's like doing the reenactments, but completely breaking the fourth wall that this is not, obviously it's not real. Like we're just doing reenactments and we're going to get opinion on it. I found that really interesting. And I hadn't seen that before, but you mentioned to me that there was another documentary that kind of did something similar to that.
Yeah. It was one that immediately came to mind where there's a filmmaker named Joshua Oppenheimer. I'm blanking on his name right now. Who made two films, one called The Act of Killing, and then a sequel called The Look of Silence. Joshua Oppenheimer, I was right. Okay, yeah, Joshua Oppenheimer was the director. And it looked at the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia and The Act of Killing. He was interviewing members of this regime that were like mid to high ranking officials in the army who were carrying out these heinous acts against its own people that they were accusing of being communists, and got them to reenact these brutal torture and murder sessions, but done in a style of popular Western movies that they were fans of. So, they put on dresses and did a little musical number singing and dancing about how they're going to kill all the communists and things like that. And you're just watching this just like literally like your mouth is on the floor and your eyes are wide open and like tears are streaming down your face and you're just like, what is going on here? And they're all laughing and joking. You're like, oh no, that's not how you chopped off someone's head. This is how you did it. And like, oh, that's right. I forgot about that. Oh yeah. And this is where the blood was all pooled up. And you're just like, what is going on here? And then in the sequel, the Look of Silence, it takes, it's this guy who is the son. His family was all murdered and he was much younger. So he's now interviewing these same people from the first movie, just sort of asking them what they did, because now they like are local politicians and own a car dealership and own a business and things like that. And so they have this like weird influence over the community still, even though the Khmer Rouge is clearly not in control anymore. And some people still support them and some people don't. And it's just very weird. And like at one point, like this guy gets threatened by these people too. But I'm not talking about these movies. They're fantastic. I will literally never watch them again, but they're beautiful works of art and some of the best documentaries ever made. That said, the reason why I bring them up is because this idea of reenacting what had happened with actual people that had experienced it and in juxtaposing it with today's society and things like that, I thought was just like a very unique way to sort of look at history and retell it. And, you know, there's this one scene in particular later on in the movie where they're reenacting a scene that takes place in a jail cell. And so they've got this student who's now playing this person from back in the 60s and 70s who's sitting in jail. He's awaiting his trial. And then they're showing the after where they're just sitting there in this, you know, I don't know if it's a real jail cell or if it's just a set. I think it's real. And they're talking to each other. And we learn that this young man is actually has been arrested and he's awaiting his court date to be sentenced. And so they're talking about what's it like being in prison and how time passes by and all this sort of stuff. And it just sort of hits this young guy so hard and so real because he's been so caught up in the moment of trying to protest and fight. And all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, this is what my life is going to be. And this older man is kind of explaining, yeah, it really sucks.
Yeah. I mean, and that guy in particular, so he was arrested when he was in middle school, for participating in the riots in the 60s. And he was saying, like, he has another bit in there where he was like, I was so patriotic towards the CCP back then. Like, he was so patriotic.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, now. And I found it interesting. Like, the interesting thing is, one, he was released from prison when he was 17. And so he was still able to, you know, put his life back together, which he did. But he was saying, like, it was tough. It was really, really difficult because for as much as we look at, you know, criminal reform is quite a topic, especially I find in North America, more so in the States, I think, than in Canada. But we do put a mark against people who have been imprisoned. And even if they were young, like, it's still something that comes up. And in like background checks, like we all have to do background checks when you join a new company, that kind of thing, right? But in Hong Kong, it's really has a real stigma attached to it that you were like a criminal. Like, it's quite like, I remember my mom watching, she went, oh no, like he was a criminal. Like, you know, even though, yeah, it's because it's just the traditional way of looking at it. Like, why did you end up in jail? Like, what did you do? Even though if it was something kind of noble, to them, it's like, no, like you broke the law. And that's kind of, you know, in keeping with this, I'm not going to encompass all East Asians in this, but there is this idea of like, you know, we're a bit more obedient as a culture. Like, we listen to our elders and we have great reverence for that. And, for rule. And I mean, you can kind of see where China ended up being where they are right now. But I found like their conversation was so interesting to me because, you know, you would think that the older guy who was arrested back then, he would have a bit more maybe empathy or compassion for why the younger student was doing what he was doing. But in fact, it was kind of the opposite of just like, what's the point? Like, he was the one, I think I pulled a quote from it in my review, and it was like, in the 150 years, like, when have we ever been able to dictate what happens in Hong Kong? Like, never. So why do this? Like, kind of, why are you ruining your life and making it that much more difficult for you? You're young, like, you have everything ahead of you. So why would you do that? And then the younger guy could, like, you know, again, it's youth and idealism where you just go, well, this is what's right. Like, this is what I believe to be right. And it's like, it's beyond Hong Kong and what's going on there right now. It's such a fascinating look of life in general. Like, when you grow up and you look back at the things that you did when you were younger, and knowing that, like, there's a bit of a universality to, doesn't matter the time period, the era, like what is happening. Students and young people will always be a certain way, and older people will always be another way, even though at one point the older people were those young people, right? Like, and I find that really interesting. Like, and that's more of a kind of a broader theme to it. But yeah, that interaction between the two of them was very, very touching and very moving. It generates a lot of discussion, I think.
Yeah. I think the last thing I sort of want to touch on about this movie is I liked how at the very end, right before the end credits, there's, you know, a whole parade of faces that we get to see and what they were arrested for. And like, some of them are like assaulting a police officer, like, oh, that sounds a little serious. And then a lot of them were just like unlawful gathering. It's like, what?
Yeah. And I think an interesting thing too to note is like, they put the occupations of the people there. And it kind of showed that it was students, it was like district counselors, it was delivery men, it was musicians, actors, it was, you know, like postmen, like it was a really wide swathe of people. Yeah. It showed it wasn't just a particular demographic. It wasn't just like a socioeconomic group either. this was something that was felt across the entirety of the population of Hong Kong. And, it didn't matter who you are, what you did, like everybody felt it in some way, shape or form. And yeah, I really like that too. And it went on for a really long time, which also was very concerning. Like it was just person after person after person after person. And yeah, it just, and these people, they're literally waiting to see what happens to them, and, I who knows what's going to happen to them, but there's more high profile people who, it was in the news recently, like the more high profile people have been jailed and they're going to court and stuff like that. But those guys that were in the film, like they're such small kind of underlings. They're going to, I think, be waiting for a really long time, which is quite torturous in itself, isn't it?
All right, so let's move on to another movie that I think is going to have just as much interesting discussion, maybe for different reasons. But the next movie we're going to talk about is Eternal Spring, which won 2 awards. One for the Rogers Audience Choice Award for Best Canadian Feature, and the Hot Docs Audience Award, which is basically a People's Choice selection. And this movie is after meeting a survivor of an activist group that boldly hacked Chinese state television to protest human rights violations, exiled illustrator Na Xiong, I hope I said that correctly, recreates the events through his art and thrillingly captures the inspiring tale of defiance in the face of injustice. So, on the surface, Blue Island, Eternal Spring, they kind of sound sort of similar, the way that they're talking about, fighting Chinese oppression and things like that. It's very interesting. And this movie also has a very unique spin on it where it's about half animated, where it's sort of, instead of using reenactments, using actors to reenact the events, they animate the events in a very unique sort of early 2000s computer generated video style that kind of had a bit of a video game look to it. But then the more you kind of are watching it and the politics being discussed, the more murkier it feels, and you're kind of left not really sure of what's happening. And it's one of the times where I can look at a movie and be like, this is a technically impressive movie, I think, from a perspective of how it was filmed and the choices they made there and the actual interviews, all very well done. But then once you start breaking apart what it all means, the kind of more uneasy I felt about it. What about you?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting because, so Falun Gong, and it's such a testy topic that, and it's I say religious group with a bit of a little flexibility in that quote unquote religious group. It's fat. Like, okay, paired up with Blue Island, I think it is very interesting in that they're both kind of looking at the same end in terms of saying, like, we're fighting against the oppression and the persecution that the CCP is placing upon us. And you could say the same thing. There's been many, many reports about what is going on in northern China against the Uyghur group of people in, like, quote unquote re-education camps. Mm-hmm. And so they're all, and Taiwan is another one, Macau is another one, like, they're all looking at the same final point, like the same kind of conclusion, which is common the CCP. Enemy. Yeah, like the CCP is doing some really shitty things, and this is not the way that the world operates anymore. It's 2022. The world is not, the days of authoritarian regimes are a bygone era. We hope, like, that's kind of the hope for what's going on. Obviously we see in other countries like Russia, that's not exactly the case. But they're coming at it from such different ways that it's hard. Like, you can't just clump everything together. Like, you can't just say it's a monolithic cause, because what is going on with, what they're talking about in Eternal Spring, it, again, very divisive. Like, it divides people. And I like the idea that it's kind of like a heist movie in a way. Like, it's showing that they were trying to take down or infiltrate the state, the cable lines for state media so that they could air their own. I thought it was funny in the subtitles, they kept writing video CD. And I thought that was really, because VCDs were such a big thing back in the day. I have many of them still. but they wanted to show a VCD of their cause and like what Falun Gong represents and the teachings and it's good and that kind of a thing. And so that's what the movie is about. But then, like you said, they add in a lot of commentary on this group and their beliefs, and it borderlines on being an advertisement for the group. And it leaves out a lot of key things that kind of make it a controversial group. They're considered to be, very far right, like in terms of our Western ideals of what we would consider, like we would consider them to be like a more far right group. Mm-hmm. And they have a lot of very, they're quite homophobic, and there's a decent amount of misogyny involved in some of their teachings. And the leader of it, like the founder of it, he's an interesting character himself. Like do you know what it reminds me of though? It's like, it reminds me of, if we take it into a North American context, specifically an American context, it reminds me of like Christian extremists, like those Christian groups that take the teachings of God or whatever. And like, there's one man, usually a man, who says like, I am the second coming of whatever, blah, 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 blah. And then they kind of create this group and they become a leader. And then we kind of put on them a bit of a cult label because they're different and they're and potentially could be dangerous. And Falun Gong is kind of like that, except they do operate on Buddhist and Taoist and Taoist traditions of meditation and something called Qigong, which is like kind of like Tai Chi-ish. It's like very slow movements and meditative exercise. And so when you do that, it looks very harmless because it's very, nonviolent, and that is something that they preach as well. But that's also like a tenet of Buddhism, is like pacifism. And so it becomes interesting, but it's like you said, the more you dig deeper into the group, the more it becomes a bit of a question mark of like, what is going on here? Like, is this movie really about CCP persecution? Is this film really trying to tell us about, is it just about the heist? I keep calling it a heist. It's not really a heist, but like, that's just all I could think of. Or is it something a little bit more? Like, is it something that is trying to push people's opinions one way or the other, without giving you a full picture of who they actually are? And I mean, to their credit, I don't think that they need to show who they are. Like, that's up to the individual to, if you are interested in them, to like go and do your own research. And I think that sometimes we rely a bit too much maybe on media and entertainment to be like, oh, both sides the story. Like, this is their opinion. This is their film. They think the group is one way. I suppose they're within their every right to do that. And it creates an interesting conversation about like, in America, those Christian groups can still exist. Like those very extreme Christian cult groups, they can exist. And some people think, what was that one? Is the Baptist Borough Church?
Yeah, the Westboro Baptist Church.
They tried to come into Canada, and Canada said, no, like you're like a hate group. You guys infiltrate hate speech, because there is a limit to freedoms.
Yeah.
Despite what the Americans think, there is a limit to freedoms. And you take the CCP and they're an extreme on the other end. So it's fascinating to look at, but as a film, I completely agree with you that there's a lot of eyebrow raising in it. But I really love the animation though. So on like a very technical aspect, I think that it reminded me of a video game called Borderlands. I don't know if you ever played that,
yep.
But it just really like the aesthetic of it. I love that. Like, I love that kind of illustration and imagery. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, where it almost looks like 2-dimensional drawings made 3D.
Like kind of like rotoscoping too, isn't it? Like
It
kind of has that feel to it. Yeah.
I think to back up a little bit, sort of explain Falun Gong to anyone who doesn't really know, you probably have seen them in Toronto. You probably see their group outside City Hall. They usually wear all yellow and do these like large formation exercises that sort of look like Tai Chi, where they're like very slow movement. They're focused on the breath and clean, slow movement, focusing your energy and things like that. So you've definitely seen them around. And I didn't really know much more than that. I kind of knew a little bit. I heard about them a bit, but I never really done a lot. But it's interesting watching a movie, sometimes you're just like, oh, wait, okay, I feel like some stuff is going on here that I'm not being told. So I paused the movie a couple times to like just do some quick reading, check out Wikipedia, what's going on, click a few links, things like that. So it was just so fascinating learning more. And the more I was reading about them, the more I realized we were being withheld some sort of information. And it's tough because the type of movie it is, where because they're fighting against the Communist Party of China, you know that they're not going to necessarily act rationally, sanely, logically, anything like that. Anything that is a threat to the CCP, they are going to, clamp down on with all of its force. And so you see, like, you hear, they're telling these stories about people being beaten mercilessly by the cops and being taken to, black sites of detention centers where they can be interrogated and beaten some more, and all the rights being taken away and everyone being homeless of this group and things like that. And you're watching and you go, yeah, I can definitely see the Chinese government doing this. Like, we hear about this in the news all the time. This makes perfect sense. But then there's also this like weird sort of disconnect where they're like, hey, we were doing nothing at all. And all of a sudden they bust down our door and are beating on us. And it's like, okay, I feel like we're missing a bit of the story here. What happened, before they, break down your door that caused all this sort of stuff? And so it's like, it's just that weird disconnect where you're like, yes, I can see the, the CCP doing this, but also, I'm trying to think logically and be like, not like, did you deserve it? But like, what happened before that caused you to put yourself on the radar of the CCP and all this sort of stuff? And all that sort of information was left out.
Yeah.
And so that was the most frustrating thing for me, is because especially when you compare it to something like Blue Island, as we were talking about at the very beginning here, is, oh yeah, you have two groups that sort of have a common enemy, but they go about different ways. It's like when you in Canada, when the NDP and the Conservatives, are arguing the same point, and you're like, wait, are you coming to the same conclusion naturally, or are you taking completely different paths to get there? That's what I need to know, whether or not who do I agree with, sort of thing. And now that's sort of what's happening is with this. It's you're like, yes, I vehemently am against the CCP, all of the injustices that they're doing to people. That's terrible, and everyone should fight back against it. But also, what path are you taking to get there is what I need to know of whether or not I support you.
So that's interesting. So I had said, like, I don't know if I necessarily think that a documentary filmmaker needs to both sides a story. Like, we've seen so many documentaries that are just, like, I think of like Fahrenheit 9/11. That's always my like example of a film that is preaching something that I mostly agree with. I agreed with what Michael Moore's presentation of that was. However, it's obviously incredibly biased and incredibly one-sided, right? Like, I always remember that he came to Toronto and did the thing of like, I'm just opening doors in Toronto. And like, and I'm like, how many though were not? Because I don't know many people who leave their doors like unlocked in Toronto. If you did, it was probably because of an accident. Like, you just kind of forgot about it or something like that. But it's not like people are just leaving their houses and walking away for like hours on end and then coming home like, oh, my door's unlocked. But anyways, so to me, it's always, documentaries are always an interesting thing because some of them can be personal essays, as we're going to get into for a documentary later. Some of them can just be informative things like, this is what's going on, like this is what's happening. And then you have something like this, which is very politically motivated, and they do have an ulterior motive. So do you think it's incumbent upon them that they should be showing you the full picture of it, even though like the person who's doing it is very clearly on one side?
Yeah. And it's just such a frustrating sort of thing where you're trying to figure it out. And there's
no right answer, is there? Like, I don't think there's a right answer. Yeah. Because it's like, they could have been tricky and been like, I'm trying to think, if I were them, what would I have done? I maybe would have raised those, like the controversies and what, the negative sides of their thing, but then like present it as, yeah, we heard that this, but actually that's not the case. Like, you can present a counter argument in it, but at least maybe raise the issue and have that out there. But
yeah, I agree. And I think also when you're watching it, and it seems like their only retort to anything is just Falun Gong is good. Okay, good at what? what are you
It's
good
literally
about?
like their slogan. Like it, I don't read very much Chinese, but like I can see like those characters every time I just passed by it the other day. Actually, I was walking through Nathan Phillips and I saw them and I was like, oh yeah, they still just say that. Like they literally just say Falun Gong is good. That's kind of their tagline, which
that
I always
doesn't tell
found
me anything.
No, it doesn't. But it's. I guess it's supposed like within the context of the CCP, which is just something simple of saying like, you know, they were so against not necessarily even the teachings of Falun Gong. I don't think. I just think that they didn't like the idea that there was a group that was not state mandated, like it wasn't under their control, and so many people were flocking towards it. And the one thing that can really bring down like the biggest threat to authoritarian regimes is like independent thought. So once you have groups starting to splinter and think about different things, you know, who knows what that leads to, right? Like that's why they don't like they ban so many books and education is very, very, very controlled over there. So I think when they were putting like when the CCP puts out their propaganda and saying like it's a terrible thing, like it's ruining our society, and their counter argument is just like a very simple, no, it's good. Like they're lying to you. It's good. It's fine.
Yeah.
And maybe, I mean, does it work? Maybe, because then you just kind of go, well, oh, it is good. But then you kind of think in China, they don't really have the same access that we do. Like you said, when you were watching it, you paused, went online, looked up some stuff.
Yeah.
And we, generally speaking, I mean, without getting too into the weeds, it's like we generally have free internet in Canada. So we're not really blocked to too much stuff. Whereas in China, they do have very strict measures of like, you know, what they're able to absorb through the internet. But we're talking about back in 99 in the early 2000s too. So the internet wasn't even widely available back then, for anybody really. And so where would they have gotten more information to go, oh, it's good. Okay. Like, do you just buy it? Or do you go like, well, I suppose maybe it's an effective thing because one, they're being told, like they've always been told what to think. And then this is the one time that somebody goes, actually, they're wrong.
Yeah.
And so maybe it spurs like it's like an inception thing. Like it plants a seed in your brain of, oh, maybe they weren't right. Like maybe the CCP wasn't right about this because somebody out there thinks that Falun Gong is good. So that's interesting. Maybe that was the whole point of why. But that's always been their tagline. Just it's good. It's good.
Yeah. Yeah, it just sort of raised more questions for me. Like,
I know.
What do you mean by good? What does good mean?
Yeah. But it's in a sense, it's a privilege that we have that we can stop and go like, what do you mean by that? Like, we need more information because we didn't grow up in a way that was just, here's a piece of information and don't be critical of it, don't be analytical of it. This is true. This is fact. That's it. That's done. Right? Like we grew up with an education system that told us like, actually, like, so what do you guys think about this? What's your opinion on it? Are they right? Are they wrong? Like. And that's a luxury we had.
Now, we got a few more movies left. We're going to talk about them a little bit less because I think those first two were the main ones we really want to hit on. But the next one is The Thief Collector, which is about a 1985 theft of William de Kooning's Woman Ochre was already a scandal. But when the perpetrators and their motives are uncovered, a far more outrageous, criminal, and utterly irresistible story of a seemingly mild-mannered couple in rural Arizona emerges.
There's basically three types of thieves. The first type is the theft of opportunity. The second is the individuals who are doing it for money.
And then there's the third kind of art thief, and that's the art thief who steals for themselves.
And those are the most dangerous.
Rita and Jerry Alter were my aunt and uncle. Oh, they were definitely soulmates, and he would do anything for her.
Their house was full of souvenirs from their travels around the world.
It seems like this couple is really the story here. They're the mystery.
What a tagline. What a summary that they wrote for
I know,
that.
right?
That's so dramatic.
It's what caught my attention.
That's really funny.
A lot of documentaries are like so super serious, and I saw this. I'm just like, you know what? I want something a little bit lighter and fun, and you know what? It's what I got. Like that. That's the kind of movie it is. But so this is a movie about how this elderly couple dies, and a appraisal company comes in to look at their belongings to figure out what's worth what and what they can sell and what should be just thrown into the garbage and all that sort of stuff. And they see this, you know, painting behind a door, and they're like, what is this painting? And so they like bring it into their shop, and suddenly someone recognizes it, and they do some research, and they realize that this is a painting that is worth, at the time, several $1,000,000, and it seems to keep ballooning up in its valuation to being up to $100 million, its value, which is kind of crazy, but that's besides the point. And then it's, who are these people and how did they come into this? And so we get reenactments, much like we get with Blue Island, a unique sort of way, where we actually have Glenn Howerton of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia fame, playing the husband in this couple, and kind of what their relationship is and how they might have gone about stealing this painting and what their lives were like. So this was a movie that you really didn't connect with, and I really did. And I think it completely comes down to the interpretation of how the facts were laid out, because you look at this movie and they present a lot of crazy theories about what may or may not have happened, and they sort of half-baked investigate them, with a lot of it just being like, and we'll never really know, I guess, but maybe it actually happened this way. And I watched that just kind of accepting it at face value and be like, that is a crazy conspiracy. I like it. And you, I feel like, on the other hand, watching it was like, yes, but this doesn't make sense. Why are you telling us this if you don't have an answer?
Because there's no point. Like, I just don't get it. I feel like my brain is missing like a fun chip or something like that. Like, I don't get it. Like, the reason I was attracted to it was because of Glenn Howerton, Dennis, the Golden God himself. Like, the fact that he was in it, I was like, okay, I love Always Sunny. And they have a podcast, Always Sunny, and he was at South by Southwest talking about his wife's documentary, and I was just like, oh, his wife's good. And then I realized this was the same one, so I was like, oh, I'm going to watch this for Dennis. I'm going to watch it for Dennis, and it just was like, I like conspiracy theories. That's the funny thing, is like, I love a good conspiracy theory. I like hearing them, and I like hearing like, Hollow Earth and stuff like that. Like, I can spend hours reading about it just because I find it fascinating that some people think this way. But like, something like this to me is, one, it's not a conspiracy theory like Area 51 or, whatever, because those are, no pun intended, like other earthly. Like, they're just like, they're about the world in general. Whereas something like this is, we're talking about two people who did exist. Like, they are real human beings that did live on this earth and who are not here anymore to defend themselves. And sure, maybe they were a bit eccentric. Maybe they were dicks. We don't know. Like you and I don't know because we didn't know them. And then we have these people who are poring over like a really crappy short story book, like a collection of short stories that the guy wrote. And they're going, oh, maybe these stories were based on truth. Like, maybe he actually did those things. And they draw the dumbest conclusions that I've ever seen, where they're just like, oh, there was a story about, how he killed a Mexican laborer and put him in a septic tank. Oh, they had a septic tank. Oh, don't you remember when you go to their house and you go to the bathroom, they will not let you flush the toilet. Like, they won't let you do that. Why was that? And you're just like, what the like, what are you talking? And then they go, that maybe he did kill somebody in their septic tank. And you're just like, what the hell are you guys talking about? Like, how? It reminded me a lot of Twitter, where it's like, they always joke like Twitter has like a villain for the day. What do they say? Yeah. Like, the main character on Twitter, whatever. And people will inevitably dig into all of the old tweets, everything that this person has ever said on the internet, and find kind of the most tenuous links to something sinister, something bad. And that's what this whole documentary reminded me of. I'm just like, we're just making assumptions based off of a crappy writer's book. Like, he did, like, and it's a fiction book as well, just putting that out there. But the thing is, we don't know one way or another, and they are very clear about that. Like, there is no evidence to show whether they did those things or didn't do those things. You can have your opinion, but is that really worth, 90 minutes of time on it, like that they poured resources into this to say, oh, maybe they did do it. But I am very much so in the minority on this, because I know that there are people who really, really enjoyed it, and they thought it was fun, because they were like, it's good that there's no answers. But I'm like, I need an answer, otherwise this is entirely pointless.
I think that's sort of where I sort of land. I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all. And most of the time it's just so frustrating where it's like, you know, all these global elites are ruling behind our backs and controlling everything, and they're going to come for you and they're going to kill you and blah, blah, blah. I'm just like, none of this makes any sort of sense. If you think about it for 2 seconds and you ask a couple simple questions, your theory completely falls apart. And yet for something like this, it's just so, for the most part, so harmless. Like, because these people are no longer alive and to defend themselves, it's kind of shitty that, like, they can't be like, yeah, I didn't kill someone. Don't make up lies about myself, please. I still have family alive and things like that. But the rest of it is just like so harmless of like, I don't know, you know, they had a lot of weird art that looks to be way more expensive than they can afford on a teacher salary and whatever the other person was working as. It was like a speech therapist and something else. I can't remember what he was. Oh, he was a teacher and she was a speech therapist. That's what it was. And they're like, yeah, I don't know how they, you know, afforded these lavish vacations all the time and were able to come home with all this lavish artwork that is clearly worth way more than they let on. And they claimed it was all fake, but in reality, they were actually real pieces of work. And they have one piece of stolen art. And so you kind of draw a bit of a semi-logical conclusion of, did they steal other art? If they stole one, could they have stolen more? And I think that's sort of where the premise, like, that's what you hone in on. And that's what I was kind of like locking in on of if they did this one thing, yes, maybe they could have done other things. Not that they did, not that it means that they did. It just means that they could have. And I think that's just something where I just like, you know, this is a fun little movie of I can lock onto that and latch onto that. And the reenactments were so entertaining with Glenn Howerton.
I did enjoy those, but that's Glenn Howerton, right? Like that's like adding a good comedic bent. And I love the way like the colors too reminded me of like a Wes Anderson movie, the way that they did them.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I take your point that it's actually, no, there's something that you said, like you said, it's like, it's harmless, right? Like a murder aside, having, you know, Mexican laborers in your septic tank, putting that whole issue aside, it's like, harmless or not, it's a character assassination, right? Like if imagine it was you and like you're not there to defend yourself, and people are just saying things that, let's assume, are outlandishly, they're just lies about yourself. And even though it doesn't amount to something of saying like, oh, well, maybe he stole it, maybe Dakota was stealing art. Like, sure, it doesn't damage the fabric, doesn't call you a murderer, but it does call you a thief, and it does call you a liar, and it does call you like a whole other slew of things. And it's like, would you really be okay with just sitting by and being like, it's no big deal. Like, it's not a huge deal. Like, you know, but it just, I don't know. This really didn't work for me. And I was just so annoyed by it. Like, I was just so annoyed that there's good money and Glenn Howerton's time is being spent on something like this, which it just leads to nothing. And I don't mind, like, you know, watching stuff that's, last year we reviewed, what was the one, Come Back Anytime. It was about the ramen place in Japan, and we both loved it. That's not really about anything, you know, it's just about a guy in his ramen shop. Like, I am not opposed to things not necessarily making a point or making a political, you know, opinion, or, you know what I mean? Like, that, it doesn't need to be that. But something like this, it's like, it's trying so hard to be, I don't know, like a Netflix true crime doc or something like that. And yet it's not even that, you know, and those aren't even that good. Like, let's be real. But like, I don't know.
I thought it knew that it was like, it felt like it was mocking those Netflix true crime docs.
Do you think that? I was wondering. Yeah, I was wondering if that's kind of what they were going for, like with the reenactments in particular. I feel like that was like, yeah, very satirical. But I did. The
reenactments were so tongue in cheek.
They were very funny. I did enjoy them. Like, I liked when Dennis, like, I keep calling him Dennis, when they steal the painting, it's like he just literally took an X-Acto knife and just cut it out of the frame. Like, it was. He's was like no shoving finesse. It down his jacket, and it's like sticking out his like shirt. That was very, very funny. Like, just like, there's no finesse, there's no sophistication behind it. It was But whatever. We're on opposite sides on this one. I know that like the majority of people they have really enjoyed The Thief Collector, because I did look up other reviews after I wrote mine, and I was like, oh, it's just me. Great.
I definitely think there's going to be a large segment of people that like it, and I can totally see if I'm normally the type of person that's like, no, that's not real. I don't believe it. And like sit there with my arms crossed and just sort of fuming internally and hate the movie. And so I totally get where you're coming from. And like, there's, if this movie took one slight misdirection, I would totally be on the exact same side as you. But I just had such a fun time with it. I think that that's what's going to get it an audience, is that Glenn Howerton is entertaining and this movie is light and fluffy enough, and it's sort of mocking the rise of the true crime docu-series that have been going around.
See, if they leaned into that more, like just been, a complete, like really, really, but then I suppose if you lean into it more, then you're kind of making a mockery of the people that you're interviewing, and that's not kind. Like, that's not a nice thing to do. But yeah, if they had done it as more of like a comedic thing in general, I think I would have been more on board for it.
Well, we'll move on now, and we'll talk about a movie called Shooting War, which was 9 internationally renowned conflict photojournalists candidly shared the physical, emotional, and psychological challenges of the front lines and their struggles to come to terms with bearing witness to war's horror and devastation.
Photographers are defined to some degree by the lasting images that they have.
Boom! Instant ambush. In 5 seconds was 19 dead and 35 wounded. And I got the horizon straight.
As soon as we published the story, bam, aid groups came, they helped these poor desperate people.
I think this job is a necessity. If there is no picture, there is no story.
We were the acme of the profession.
This is a documentary that's produced by the Globe and Mail, and they gathered all these people to give some sort of a talk. And then they basically turned their, talk into a movie where they interviewed them one-on-one, kind of recounting their life stories. And while they're talking about the different places that they've been to, we get to see their actual photographs. And it's one of those movies that, from a documentary making level, this movie is awful. There's almost next to nothing interesting. It's someone talking in front of a black screen behind them, and then every once in a while some photos pop up. But because these people have such interesting stories to tell, and their photos are so evocative and bring up so many emotions of everything that has happened in the world, whether you can personally relate to what they were photographing or not as a spectator, it just really hits you hard emotionally. And so that's one of those things where it almost sort of feels like the type of movie you'd watch in school, where you're like, okay, we're going to learn about this today. And it's just so dry. But because the people talking are interesting and fascinating, and the footage that they're showing you is gripping, you pay attention and you'll learn a lot. And it's almost nice that there are zero frills to this movie. It's just if you're to review it from a filmmaking perspective, there's next to nothing. It's someone putting a camera on a tripod and hitting record.
Don't you find it's probably for non-Canadian audiences this won't make sense, but it's like it is a very Globe and Mail production. Like, you would expect nothing more, nothing less from the Globe and Mail to do something like this. Like, it's quite, like, it's nice looking, like it's good quality photos and footage, and the interviews. Like, it looks swish and like it's very sophisticated. Like you said, they have the black backgrounds, and so it makes it look very like you're in a studio. It's very whatever. But the material itself can be, I don't want to say dry, because like you said, it's touching on some really important things. And I think like one aspect about it that I enjoyed, it's like when everything that's going on in Ukraine right now, I was kind of making a bit of fun of being like, why are there so many pictures of Zelensky all over the place? I'm like, who's taking these pictures? But then the thing is, and it's just kind of like, it's funny that he has a photographer at these things. But then, I took a step back and I realized, like, no, you need that. Like, you do need a record of something, because if we don't have that, the saying is always like, history is told by the victors. And if, unfortunately, the victor doesn't end up the wrong, what you would think maybe is the wrong victor, like the wrong side won, because that does happen, then the evidence that the other side was doing something, and that's gone. And so you do need evidence of the devastation that's being caused. You do need evidence of, how murky war is, not just the spoils of war. And what these conflict photographers do is so important. Like, it's such an important job, but a job that I think it gets very, very overlooked in general, because how often do you think of the photographer when you're looking at a picture, right? You just, oh, it's a nice picture, especially in our like social media age of just scrolling. Like, we're just scrolling through, clicking through like photo galleries and things like that. And you just go, oh man, yeah, like that's really moving. That's really sad. Like, oh my God, look at that. Okay, now on to the next thing, right? Like, we don't pause as much when, for instance, if you're reading a National Geographic, like the magazine, when we were younger, like you could actually sit there and like flip through it. I mean, you still can today, but I don't know how many people do that. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that the people who took these pictures, what they're doing is, firstly, it's very worthwhile what they're doing. It's a very important job that they have, but also it really can weigh on you. Like, it's not a great job by any stretch of the imagination. It does a lot of damage to you, because if you're just surrounded by devastation and sadness and grief all day long, and that's your career, like, it can drive anybody mad. So there was a lot of, touching stories about people who, a lot of them had like suicidal thoughts. A lot of them, they deal with, I think all of them deal with, mental health issues that they need to get addressed. And some of them, depending on how old they were, or how old they are, they don't actually go and get the help that they need, because to them, it's like, I take pictures for a living, So I think it's an interesting look and something that's worthwhile to see. But I completely agree with you in terms of like the actual filmmaking side of it. It's a very paint by numbers documentary, but the subject matter is quite fascinating.
Yeah, I think sort of, going back to your point of you must document these things. It sort of reminds me of this story. I wish I could remember who had said it or where it came from, but I just remember that at the end of World War II, when the concentration camps were being liberated, there was someone in the U.S. Army that was like, down the line, people are going to argue that this didn't happen or try to claim that it wasn't as bad as it actually was. So he made sure that every concentration camp was photographed meticulously, like literally hundreds and thousands of photographs for preserving literally the worst aspects of that, because he knew that maybe not in 1 year, maybe not in 2 years, but down the line, people are going to start to argue against it. And sure enough, I know it was a big thing in the 80s where people tried to deny that the Holocaust happened. And they were able to be like, no, look at these photos. This is why we took all these photos. And it's sort of the same thing that you were touching on of the worst aspects of humanity need to be preserved and recorded, so that way down the line, people can't say that didn't happen.
And hopefully we learn from it and say, like, we can't let this happen again. Because taking your point about the Holocaust, like, if you just said it, this is what happened, it sounds really unbelievable, because I think we don't like to believe that humans could do something like that. We like to believe that we're not capable of such monstrous, like just such crazy things to do to another human being, right? Like we like to think we're more evolved than that. But we weren't, and when I say we, I just mean like humans as a species. Like, it's not always going to be working together and doing the right thing. Like, there are going to be people who just do absolutely terrible things. And so having those photos and the videos too, like, there's a lot of videos that were on in after the camp liberations. And yeah, it's just a reminder of what happened, and hopefully we don't do it again. And I'm glad that, it's funny, I think about it today when you were saying that, it's like, I imagine people today, if God forbid something like this happens again, I mean, you could argue it is happening in some parts of the world. It's like nowadays we're so jaded. We're just like, oh, that picture's obviously doctored. Like, they obviously photoshopped that, or they did something like that, but back then that kind of stuff, maybe it existed, but like, I don't think it was photoshopping wasn't a real skill back then. Nor I don't think the technology was really around there. So it's important. And, I'm glad that we have people who are willing to not just risk their life, like physically speaking, but like really risk their mental health in the name of doing something that is more important than I think that we all appreciate it to be.
Yeah, I try to remember what was the terminology that they were talking about, where it was like
moral injury.
Yeah, moral injury.
Yeah.
That's it. Thank you. Yeah, because we talk about PTSD and things like that, and that was something that these journalists suffer, but also sometimes it's not quite that, but it's similar to that. And this idea of moral injury of, as soon as you hear that concept, you're just like, oh my God, that makes so much sense when you're photographing something of, someone literally dying and you're wondering, you're questioning, am I doing the right thing? Am I invading someone's privacy? Am I whatever is going on? And you're going through all these different thoughts in your head of, is this the right thing or wrong thing to do? And you coin the term moral injury, and suddenly it makes so much sense, and you can understand how people in this situation could suffer from that and lead to different types of depression, anxiety, whatever, spiraling out of control, leading to substance abuse and what have you. And they talk about that. They talk about, like, especially the older guy who's photographing Vietnam War, and he talked about how he'd come back and start doing drugs openly in his office because he couldn't handle the pressure of all the things that he had seen and witnessed, and was just sort of lashing out.
And it's interesting, these days when we talk about because everyone's got a camera in their pocket now. And so if you see something bad happen, people just put their cameras up. And so many times people go, why didn't you go do something? Why didn't you go help that person that was being berated instead of just standing by videotaping them? And I wonder if, I think that these photographers must have an aspect that even though in a war zone, what are you going to do? You shouldn't do anything, actually, because you probably are going to mess something up. But there is that feeling of such helplessness and probably a bit of guilt that, I'm just here to photograph it. I'm not here to help the situation in any way, shape, or form, in the immediate anyways. But about moral injury, I just want to just say, so that term was coined by a professor from U of T, University of Toronto, called Anthony Feinstein. And he worked for Sunnybrook, and he had created an article with the Globe and Mail, a series that you can find on the Globe and Mail's website still. It's an interesting series of, and then that's what kind of got turned into the documentary. But that's what this whole film is based off, is his work, is Professor Feinstein's work.
Greetings, we're Technically a Conversation, a podcast for curious people by curious people.
Every week, we take turns presenting a new topic, and the other host has no idea what the topic will be.
We strive to educate in a way that's loose and fun. Our topics are all over the place, from light and funny to dark and sometimes spooky.
Some of the topics we've covered include urban legends, civil rights activists, vampires, pop culture icons, the supernatural and occult, spies and espionage, science and astronomy, and other weird and random things.
If any of these topics interest you, give our podcast a shot. Listen and subscribe at technicallyaconversation.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. Parental advisory, we might use strong language.
Well, let's move on to the last movie we're going to talk about, and that's one called Escape. Following the fall of the Khmer Rouge regime, a woman and her infant daughter are forced to flee for their lives in 1981. 40 years later, the daughter, now a filmmaker, traces her mother's courageous steps and confronts their past. This is going to be a bit of a tricky one for me to kind of review. We talked about it a bit before we started recording. And it's funny, I sort of feel like there's a bit of a theme this year with the movies that we talked about as far as, oppressive regimes and things like that. And that sort of just works out to the types of movies that we ended up watching this year. Already talked about the Khmer Rouge earlier when I was talking about the act of killing. This is a absolutely gorgeous, stunning movie. I know it's sort of funny following documentarians on Twitter and their sort of love-hate relationship with what drones have brought to the game, and that they're able to get these very beautiful composed aerial shots where they're very mechanical as far as we move forward this much and then we stop exactly and we're zooming in and we're zooming out. It's all very controlled and beautiful because you're using machines in the same way that stuff like steady cams and dolly shots have done for other types of filmmaking. And I found this movie had some phenomenal drone shots, just some of the most gorgeous ones I've ever seen shooting Cambodia and all the beauty that this country has to offer. But the problem was I just found the way this movie was presented to be so boring, and I feel terrible feeling that way because this is such a personal story about a young woman who, you know, was born in Cambodia but doesn't remember being there because she was so young, and her trying to retrace her mother's steps of what did she have to go to free herself from this terrible life and to give me this life that I now have in France. And it's this beautiful story, very personal, so affecting, but the way it's told in the way that they choose to shoot it and have the narration and the interviews and all that sort of stuff, just, it didn't connect for me. And I feel awful saying that, but like much in the same way, we can praise something like Eternal Spring for its
good point.
Formal inventiveness, despite the fact that we disagree with the way the subject matter is presented. I can disagree with the way the formal narrative and the information is presented in this documentary, despite the fact that I can connect the dots of this as important, well-made film.
It's such a funny thing. Like, it's such a, I think documentaries in particular have such a, they have this contradiction in a way of like, the subject matter is one aspect of it to talk about, but then the filmmaking is the other. And generally speaking, when you have something as personal as this and as meaningful as this, it's like the filmmaking, I don't want to say doesn't matter, because I think it does, because it's like, we shouldn't be belaboring over like, oh, like, you know, the pacing and the editing, it wasn't really great like that, because it's not about that, right? And there was another film, like we were talking about this before we came on here, I was like, there's another movie called Silent Beauty that is a part of that, which I had the same quote unquote problem with, where the subject matter is so important and it is so deep and tragic that to talk about the filmmaking feels very trite and very silly. Like, it's just what's the point of it? Like, why are we talking about, you know, that when this movie is not about that? The movie is about so much more. But the fact is, it's like, if you can have a really beautifully written book, like the story is beautiful, but if there's a ton of grammar errors, if the paragraphing is off, the formatting is off, you're not going to enjoy it, because like the thing is, you need the medium to connect with you in some way, shape, or form. So I completely get what you mean by, even though it's something that's important and you know it is, it just didn't connect with you because it just wasn't delivered in a way that you find palatable, I suppose, best way to say it. I liked it. I think I enjoyed the documentary. I liked the story of it. I thought I enjoyed the dynamic between the mom and the daughter. I appreciated that, you know, for instance, because the mom really didn't want to talk about it. And I thought it was funny that the daughter's like, I don't care, like, we're doing this documentary because, and I see where she's coming from, you know, and I think as I get older, I think about it's like, you know, family histories get lost all the time because, especially I think for Asian people, we don't talk about it. Like, people don't like talking about their history of, like, you know, I have a lot of friends, like Korean friends, for example, whose families, you know, there's like a North and South split, and nobody wants to talk about that. Like, they don't want to talk about the fact that they have an uncle that lives in North Korea and no one knows what's going on with him. And it's sad to think of, because we should be capturing our history a little bit better and not so ashamed to talk about the tragic things. And, you know, I do think it is kind of quite an Asian thing to just be like, I'm not going to talk about the bad stuff. I'm just going to talk about the good stuff. And like, why dwell on it? Why look at that, you know? And so I can understand why the mom too was like, I'm never going back to Cambodia. Why would I ever go back there? I left it for a reason, right? Like, I built my life in France for a reason. And yeah, I enjoyed it. I don't think it's the best documentary that was ever made. Like, I completely see your points and I understand why it might not have connected with you, but I enjoyed it. I did connect with it, and I didn't find it like that other movie, Silent Beauty, was one that I just completely didn't connect with, and I just didn't connect with it at all. Whereas this one I did, and I can see a lot of similarities running between the two, in terms of how they're made, in terms of filmmaking.
Maybe this would be the type of movie that if I saw it in a theater where I could be more immersed, I might have enjoyed it more, because so much of it was about like the meditation of past with these very slow tracking shots of the landscapes and things like that, where there's just not a lot happening, you know, and there's lots of scenes of like waves crashing, and what does that mean as far as the symbolism goes, and things like that. I think if maybe I was in a theater, I'd be able to be a little bit more immersed by it. But in this case, yeah, it was like, oh, how much of this movie is left? Oh, I got a text message. I'll quickly reply to that, and things like that. And we're just like, oh boy, it just didn't hold my attention. But yeah, I found it very funny, this aspect of this woman wanted to make this documentary come hell or high water, and the mother's like, no, I'm not talking about this. It was tough. It was hard. Yeah. I survived. That's all you need to know.
But I get it, you know, and we were talking about, you know, World War II and the Holocaust before. It's like, there are so many survivors from the Holocaust who don't ever want to talk about it. Like, the fact is, they all have like a tattoo on their arm that reminds them every day, and they don't want to talk about it as much as we want to say. And, you know, when we're asking for these stories, you know, I already brought up the idea of privilege, but it's like we are asking from a point of privilege because we don't have to face those things. Like, we want to know because we go, it's important to preserve the history. But to them, they're kind of like, who the hell cares? Like, I had to deal with this and I don't want to talk about it. Like, this is something that it ravages your brain far beyond anything that we could ever comprehend because we've never lived in that situation. So I do, like, on one hand, I see why the daughter is like, this is important. We got to do this, especially being a filmmaker herself. Like, this is something that is worthwhile. But I completely understand where the mom's coming from as well. Just being like, leave it alone, please. Like, this was a sad thing to go through. A lot of people that she knew, like, who were making the migration didn't make it, you know, and they talk about like infant babies were just left behind. Women were being raped. Like, it was a lot of crappy things that happened. So why are you making me relive this? But you know, I think it's worth it. It's just a shame. Like, I do understand why you might not want to relive those tragic moments of your life, especially because, like, you know, and I think the mom talks about too, about being in Paris and being like, I bought this house, like, I made this life for myself, and she should be proud of that. And why not focus maybe on that instead versus why are we focusing on all the crappy things? Like, why not focus on, look what I turned my life into in a different country. Like, she didn't speak French before she got there. Now, like, look at her. She's Frenching it up all the time. Like, it's great.
Yeah. And then, like, a little spoiler alert, it's just very funny at the very end. The daughter is back in Cambodia, and we reveal that she has a young daughter of her own that's, you know, probably 4 years old or something like that. And she, like, says to her daughter, next time Grandma will come with us. And I'm like, nope, Grandma ain't coming back there.
She not coming. Do not use a grandchild to guilt her into going. No. I get it. Like, just respect the fact that they all want to go. And the mom did offer, like, stories. Like, she did, even though she didn't want to, like, she does recount some of it. It's just, I can, like, you know, why do you want to talk about, like, the worst moments of your life? Especially because it happened so long ago too.
Well, that sort of wraps up all the ones that we both saw that we want to talk about. Very, very, very briefly, we both have ones that we want to recommend. We'll kind of touch on them. I saw one called The Art of Silence, which is a documentary about the famous mime Marcel Marceau, who is a French mime who sort of captured the world's imagination in the 70s onwards with his pantomime act. This is a movie, you know, Marceau was always a very reclusive artist, and not a lot of people knew a lot about him, despite the fact that he, you know, gave tons of interviews and was very public. It was always about the craft. And I think this movie does an interesting job of, you know, showing why the craft was so important to him. And we do get some very interesting backstory, you know, especially once again, going back to World War II, him being Jewish, and when the Nazis invaded France, what that sort of did to his family and stuff like that, and how he sort of became a bit of a resistance fighter. But then the movie is sort of told from the perspective of his wife, who is still alive, two of his daughters, and his grandson, who are working on a production sort of celebrating his work, and how they sort of come to terms with reinventing incorporating the things that he was most known for, but making it their own, but still doing a good job of honoring him at the same time. And so it's very interesting, sort of this intergenerational family story of how do you revisit a famous person's legacy now that they're gone, and how best to celebrate them. If you're a fan of, of arts and, performance and stuff like that, it's got a whole bunch to offer, and I wholly recommend it. I really enjoyed it. It's funny, it's sad, it's sweet. It kind of hits all the different notes, and more specifically, it sort of sheds light on a subject, on a person who I knew about, but didn't know a lot. And I sort of learned a lot about, and so I appreciated that.
I liked that idea of the film because, for Marcel Marceau to be one, because so many people know the name, and I don't know how many, I know nothing about him other than he's a mime. That's it. Yeah. I don't know anything beyond that, but yet his name has been, and how is it a mime became so prevalent in pop culture that I remember, I think the first time I ever heard it was in a Friends episode. They say something about Marcel Marceau, and I was like, oh yeah, okay. I don't know what that is, but it's something that comes in your head, and something that everyone knows what it is, but no one really knows what it is at the same time, which I think it's such an interesting topic for a documentary. The one that I saw that you didn't get a chance to see, and I do highly recommend it for you in particular because I think you'll really like it, is the Kids in the Hall documentary. It's called Kids in the Hall Comedy Punks was the full name for it. For anyone who doesn't know, and shame on you if you don't know who these guys are, it is a comedy troupe group that came out of Toronto. They're from across Canada, but they organized, shall we say, in Toronto back in the 80s. And they were basically an alternative to Saturday Night Live, and then what would later come Mad TV. In Canada, there was also something called SCTV at the same time, though that was a bit more of a mainstream hit. Kids in the Hall was always this kind of alternative underground, suburban angst, and they were quite edgy for their time. They talked about things like alcoholism, and one of them, the guy, Scott Thompson, he was fully out as gay, and that for the time period, it's kind of funny to think of now, because really nowadays, if you're out, no one really cares that much. But for him, it was being out in the 80s, and not just being out, but being very a very proud gay man, and using sometimes borderline stereotypes or whatever, flamboyancy in his performance for the time was very, very edgy. And especially when you add on the fact that at that moment there was an AIDS epidemic happening, and so it felt a bit more you didn't really talk about being gay then. And the documentary just goes over their formation in Toronto, each of them individually, what they got up to, the highs and the lows of their career as a group. And then they go over some of the kind of the more sad bits of their career as well. Scott Thompson was diagnosed with leukemia. Two of the guys, Dave Foley and the other guy's name's blanking my head right now, but they had a bit of a falling out. Two of the other guys shipped off to SNL at one point, because Lorne Michaels was actually a really big supporter of Kids in the Hall. So that documentary is actually out on Amazon Prime now, so you don't even have to wait for it. Very, very good. Recommend it. If you don't know much about the kids, watch it, educate yourself. If you do know a lot about them already, it's really cool watching them talk about their career. They do a group interview, and they also do individual interviews, and it's fantastic. It's a really, really well done doc. And they released a new season of Kids in the Hall, which is also on Amazon Prime. So I think that just got released last night on the 13th, if I'm not mistaken. So basically May is the month of Kids in the Hall, and I would highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in comedy, and or if you're just a fan of Kids in the Hall.
You'll love it. I'm very excited to watch this. I'm excited to watch the new season. It's sad that I wasn't able to watch it, and we can discuss it, but yeah, that's definitely something that's right in my wheelhouse.
Yeah, I knew you would really like it, and I would have loved to have been able to share that with you, but I couldn't. So, but yeah, I think you in particular, I think you'll really like it.
Awesome. Well, I think that wraps up our coverage of Hot Docs for this year. Another fantastic festival. I'm very happy that we got the chance to talk about it. Rachel, where can people find you and more of your work?
You can go to rachelkh.com and on Twitter at _RachelKH.
Awesome. And I will link to your reviews in the show notes. So you wrote about several of these movies, and so people can read about your thoughts more there. You can follow this show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at contrazoompod. If you saw anything during Hot Docs, let us know. Send an email to contrazoompod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. Thanks for checking this out.